haere mai. Welcome to this very special webinar that will launch the Tangata Whenua Community and Voluntary Sector, aka Community Research, special collection of research on housing in Aotearoa. And a very special welcome to our deaf community, and thank you to WordsWorth and our sign language interpreter, Natasha, for being here. And a special thanks must go to Jordan Green, who is supporting our research programs, who beautifully rallied us here today and very much protected the kaupapa of today. Ko Janie Walker, tōku ingoa. My name's Janie Walker. I'm a contractor with Community Research. He karakia tīmatanga tēnei. Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga. Kia mākina kina ki uta, kia mātaratara ki tai. E hiake ana te atakura, he tio, he huka, he hauhu, tihei Māori ora. A special welcome to our amazing presenters. We know you're super busy. On behalf of community researchers, Kaimahi and Kaitiaki, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your awesome experiences and knowledge. So how did we get here? Community research set about to create a special collection of research on housing. We started just over a year ago, and I'd like to acknowledge contractor Lydia Carson and also Godi Nandidkar, who had a lot to do with this beautiful, beautiful report. Please introduce yourself in the chat, your name and where you're from, if you're happy to do so. And please feel welcome to comments through the chat. We'll hopefully have time for 2 or 3 questions, but as you can see, we've got these 4 amazing panelists, and so we'll see what we've got time for. For those of you who don't know community research, we don't do research itself. We collect and gather and honour and respect existing research, lived experience and knowledge. And we value lived experience and knowledge alongside academic research. We also support community researchers and shift perspectives in how research should be done so that whānau and community aspirations can be met. We have 3 general collections: our community research collection, our whānau order collection, and our What Works collection. And we have special collections of research. You can ignore one voice, but you cannot ignore a whole bunch. So as I said, we set out to create a collection of research, and what we found was there was so much research already duplicate. So what we did instead was we focused on what we feel are the gaps in this research, and now we are here to advocate for these gaps to be filled, not changed for many people, and that's what we will be working through today, so that whānau and community aspirations and their whole lives can be met. I'd like to acknowledge the incredible amount of research done in the housing space, and this report is just an inquiry, and we would have missed some important people out. Maybe you're one of them. Aroha mai. This is just a start and a provocation for you to get in touch with us so you can be included, so that you and the people that you serve, so their voices can be heard. We are a platform for you. I also want to acknowledge that there has been some research done in the gaps that we found. As I said, this is just a start. So what is the opportunity here today then? This is what we'll be exploring. I'm very happy to introduce our first panelist, Eden Skipper, who's a remarkable young person. Skipper is a kaitiaki for community research. He'll talk about his connection with this housing collection and also the gaps that the collection highlights, and no doubt other extremely interesting things. Eden is passionate about youth, the environment and Māori development. He's currently on the board of Generation Zero, a youth-led climate change action organisation. Eden, please introduce yourself and talk a bit about the significance and gaps found in this research. Tēnā koe, Eden.
Tēnā koe, Janie. Mauri ora tātou, ko waia, ko te upoko o tahumata te maunga, ko kāna awa, ko taki te mutuoka, ko kaitahu waitaha ka te maumoi. Oku iwi, ko kipa whānau, ko Eden Skipper toko ongo. Thank you, Janie, for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be here as kaitiaki supporting this kaupapa as part of my role in community research. Thinking about what makes a good kaitiaki or someone who looks after the legacy after years, what's the role of whakapapa and the importance of whakapapa. And when I was offered this privilege to speak about this, I thought about, well, what's some of the whakapapa and my insights into housing and how that's changed over time. The first, if I think historically, what's the role of a house? So if we take in first principles, simple terms, why do we live in houses? Why don't we just live under the stars? Why don't we live in boats? So for me, my understanding of the role of a house is a safe place for you and your whānau is fundamentally the most important thing. But also it's a reflection of your identity. And if I just acknowledge the background which I have, which is Māko Marae, there's a lot of identity in this marae that we have. And for those who have been to different marae and different cultural spaces, you acknowledge that. And if we think about inside the walls of the wharenui, we have a lot of our tūpuna and those people who are part of this whakapapa and legacy that we have as we walk in there, as we order and talk about important things, we're in the presence or the oversight of those who were before us. And that's all built into this space or this wharenui where we I'm going to pepper through a few facts based the kōrero which I have, and it relates to the gaps. So some historical research which I looked at was how many people per dwelling there is and how that's changed. So if I think about in 1881, there was an average of 5 people per household. If we think about now, well, the most recent data that I could find in 2012 was 2.5, so half that. And so that makes me think about, well, what does that mean in terms of the behaviours that we have? If we've only got a few people or people living by themselves, what does that mean for us as a country and how they fit into community? So the size of houses and how many people in those houses impact the culture that we have, and noting that that's getting smaller. I would also like to acknowledge rangatahi. I fit into that group. It's also acknowledged as one of the gaps. And so one of the areas of importance for me, which I identified as in 1986, so not too long ago, only about a couple of generations, 61% of rangatahi aged 25 to 29 owned their own home. If we think about the 2018 context, that's 43.7%. So that's a significant drop in rangatahi who own their own houses, noting that the population's growing as well. If we move to some of the current context, and there'll be much more talk about the current gaps, which is identified in the research, such as renting, lived experience, homelessness, and rangatahi. A couple of things that I'd like to consider that I've been thinking about is the impact of COVID, and some economists would call it this tightening gap per se. Interest rates are going up, and that's hitting people really hard. At the moment, I'm personally in a renting situation. I fortunately have not seen that, but if my landlord's having to pay an extra $600 per week in his mortgage, if it rolls over, then I suspect that to impact on myself. And I'm sure many others will be in these situations, whether they're a renter or a homeowner. This is a difficult context for many people. The next thing that I like to think about and question is the role of natural disasters. So, and the evidence of the work of the flooding hasn't quite come up yet. If I think about the Christchurch earthquake, which there's lots of good evidence on and research in terms of the impact of that, 3,500 houses plus had to be demolished and 10,000 homes had to be rebuilt. If something similar happened in today's context, 3,500 houses had to be demolished. If we take the median house price of $790,000, that equates to around $2.7 billion that would be hit us immediately. That's excluding the 10,000 homes that had to be rebuilt. And the reason why I say natural disasters is we've just gone through the cyclone, and Aruanui to the whānau and Te Rāwhiti up in Northland, and obviously Hawke's Bay as well, and that impact will be hitting us. And many people who don't have a safe place for themselves or their whānau. And just lastly, to finish up, is thinking about the future state. So we have these contexts that we have, but what's the future state? And another thing that I considered is, well, if we think into the future 2100, so 77 years from now, how many people will we have in Aotearoa? And I'll come to that briefly, but if you want to put some answers in the chat or some guesses in the chat, I'll finish off with what the answer was, based on a 1.5% growth rate, which is a rough average that I've used. And the future state for me, what I'm thinking about is, what's the role of a house? How does this impact? How might our behaviours in relationship with houses change? I mentioned around people per dwelling is getting smaller, that it's harder for rangatahi to get into housing, and what might that mean? For many of us, and similar age to sort of myself, between the 25 to sort of 35 age, this, the keen experience to get a van and travel around the country, or to go to other countries, and we see many people do that, or it's buying a tiny house because it's much more affordable. So that's some of the things that I'm really interested in, is based on the challenges in the current context that we have, how is that going to influence the behaviour that we have? And research has a key role in that. So from this knowledge that's put forward, how do we make sure that we have the right forces and research included? And at this stage, the research has identified that there's gaps with us youth, those that are in a renting situation, homelessness or houselessness, and then also lived experience as well. So I look forward to the remainder of the panel. It's great to be here. These are some of the thoughts and partai that I've had. And for those who are questioning around what the population of Aotearoa will be based on 1.5% growth rate, it's 16.1 to 17 million people. And the question is, where are those homes going to fit? That's triple what our current population is. And what does that mean for the context that we have? So, kia ora tātou, it's great to be here, and I look forward to the remainder of the kōrero that there is today.
Kia ora, Eden. Thank you very much for that. I know you've got to toddle off at 11:30 for something that urgent that's come up for you. I just wanted to ask you if there is some research that should and needs to be picked up right now, whether it's in those gaps that our report identified or something else, what would that be for you?
For me, there's a great bit of work that Motu has done on the Healthy Homes Standard, and it highlights and exacerbates the importance of having a home that has slightly better standards that was put forward in the Healthy Homes Assessment, saying, actually, we need some basic things like there needs to be ventilation over an oven, there needs to be proper insulation. I'd say that's a piece that really needs to be looked at in the political space, and I do love pushing in the political space, because we've got an election and we've got issues, and politicians should be responsible for some of those issues. That's why they get appointed. So looking at that, there's some really great work put into there which says how important it is and the benefits to people, so that they do have not only a safe place to live, but a healthy place to live. They're not getting sick, they're not getting rheumatic fever for a tamariki. That's really important, and that shouldn't be if the landlord's got some pūtea to do up the house so it's fit for purpose. No, it's an expectation, it's a right that they should have. So there's some really good work in there. Politicians usually like return on investment sort of models and what's important. That does it quite well. So I think that's a piece that's really great. I would also encourage people to look up Wellington's Worst Housing, which was a campaign that Generation Zero did alongside a number of other groups, and that looked at Wellington's Worst Flats, and they did a campaign to find Wellington's worst flats in terms of what's worst for money and various other things. So I'll share that in the chat if I have time to find it as well. But there are two that I'd suggest: Motu, Healthy Homes Impact Assessment, and the Generation Zero Wellington's Worst Flat.
Beautiful, thank you. Just one quick question before you do go is, just because we do get, let's say we fill these gaps, just because we have this beautiful research that's required, how can agencies work together better to ensure that this research creates changes in policy, legislation, action, more support for local initiatives? Because you worked in government in some degree, what would be your kind of top takeaway for agencies to work better together to action gaps that are filled?
It's a great question, but also something that's really important. I think if research is developed that's left in a cupboard or left in the researcher's mind, and that's all where it stays, then I think that's you know, a concern and a missed opportunity of all the work that they've done and important work that they've done. In terms of how do you create action from when there is some good research, I think part of it, for me, if I think first principles is whakawhanaungatanga in the context that people are coming from. It is a bit of a skill to work with government. It's not putting forward an issue and saying this is important, so do it. That's kind of what protests are for, and other forms or lobbying, which is why I'm involved in Generation Zero, because that definitely has a role. But if you want this research to go places, it's understanding who are the right ears this needs to go to. Is it straight to the minister? Is it the Ministry of Housing? Is it the wider public? So ask yourself first, who needs to hear this and who's in a position to take action? Who's got the energy, the passion, the time about this to take some action so that it is picked up, so that we're not waiting another 50 years and we still have you know, bad housing that we have in some cases of the country. So find those people, find your mates, find your allies, get to know their context, where they're coming from, what's important to them, and work through and make sure that that the knowledge and what's formed can relate to action. But it's all about how do you form relationships and how do you make sure that those relationships further this work as well.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Eden. I think a bit later Ben might be talking about that as well, as that kind of, yeah, that communication side and that action side. Thank you, Eden, for your time. It's always lovely to talk with you. Our next person is Aaron Hendry, who, for those of you who know a bit about him, he works tirelessly in some very tricky areas. He's a youth advocate, social worker, writer, podcaster, rangatahi advocate, and a political commentator on social justice issues. His mahi is largely focused on ending youth homelessness in Aotearoa, and he's a founding member of Manaki Rangatahi, a collective fighting to end youth homelessness in Aotearoa. He's also a board member for Massey Community Trust and has had a key role in developing the Safety Net Project, a community initiative to support rangatahi experiencing homelessness. Aaron, haven't finished yet. Aaron is also the founder of When Lambs Are Silent, a Substack and podcast focused on highlighting both the voices and perspectives of those on the front lines of social justice mahi. And I just want to quote something I found on Aaron's LinkedIn page yesterday. As long as building houses is at the core of our response to homelessness, we will not end homelessness in Aotearoa. Aaron, tēnā koe, Aaron, please introduce yourself and talk about your current mahi and anything else you'd like to share about this kaupapa.
Kia ora, tēnā koutou katoa, ko tāke, ko Erehi, ko Itari, ko Kotarani, ko Ingarihi, te whakapaparange mai. Engari, ko Rangi Tupuni, te whenua tapu, ko Massey te kainga, ki West Harbour o e noho ana. He kaimahi taihohi, ko Aaron Hendry toko ingoa. Well, thanks so much, te whānau, for having me here today. So yeah, I mean, that was a great intro. I do a lot of mahi around youth homelessness specifically, so that's really where my focus is. I'm a youth development worker, and also quite involved in sort of advocacy and trying to look at both of those ends, like how do we practically create solutions within our communities to really offer opportunities to make some change for our rangatahi, and also how do we create that bigger systems change. So yeah, I'm really privileged to be a part of a collective called Manaki Rangatahi. Bianca Johansson's our leader and coordinator, and she is leading the fight in terms of ending youth homelessness in Aotearoa, and we're a movement that's growing. It started in Tamaki, but it's really grown to the Waikato, up north and around the country. So yeah, really privileged to be with you all today. I'm looking forward to the questions and getting into this kōrero. I think you muted yourself, Janae.
Never mute a person. When we talk about youth homelessness, what are some of the things that you continue to see in that space where there hasn't been change? And then also, what are some changes that you are seeing that offer a beautiful amount of hope and a beautiful amount of opportunity for whether it's government or any other kind of system or function can and should support?
Things we continue to see. Yeah, we still have a situation where there is a huge lack of resources available for rangatahi. So look, if you have a young person that experiences homelessness tonight, we cannot guarantee that we will find them a safe place for them to stay and live while you try to support them to find other options and other alternatives. And so what can happen is a young person can end up living rough on the streets. They can be couch surfing. Just last week I heard of a young mother who was sleeping in her car, and there was a real gap around where she could go that was going to be safe for her and her child. And that's a common story that services are hearing often. We still have a situation where we're putting a lot of young people into motels and into a hotel accommodation. That's really mixed results. At times it can be really harmful to those young people. And some young people have expressed concerns that their experience living rough on the street felt safer than going into some of these hotels because of the conditions that they were living in and sometimes the complexity of those who were living with them. So that's a real big concern. And one of the things we know that we need is a real detailed strategy around how we're going to end and prevent youth homelessness. We know that it can be done, but we need to start examining the pipelines that are leading young people into these experiences and then starting to build the infrastructure needed to prevent it. But some of the things that are happening, I guess, when we started this work, probably 5-10 years sort of working on this, but Manaki Rangatahi about 5 years ago, we started advocating for this. There was a time where, a lot of people didn't understand that youth homelessness was an issue. We'd be speaking to people within various ministries, within government, and having to explain that it was actually a problem. And that's despite census data saying for quite a long time that almost 50% of those experiencing homelessness are young people. And so we hadn't had that focus on it, but now there's starting to be a growing understanding that this is an issue. We're starting to see different ministries starting to think, well, how can we respond to this? How do we collect that data? And so we've got a long way to go, but we are starting to see some movement in that area, which is really exciting.
What solutions have you found that young people with rangatahi are coming up with themselves? I mean, often it's the people at the heart who can offer the best solutions. What are you hearing and seeing at the moment?
Yeah, well, I think and even maybe pushing back onto your last question as well around like the good things. One of the things that I've been really privileged to see over this time is a group of young people that have, based on sort of some services that got sort of organised and set up over the last 5 years, we now have a cohort of rangatahi that have come through and are now becoming advocates themselves, right? And starting to join us in this work. And so we're working together on solving these issues. And that's really exciting for me. And one of the things that I hear often from our rangatahi advocates, those who've got this lived experience, is that it's so much more than bricks and mortar. It's so much more than just getting housing. It's about community. It's about connection. It's about healing generational trauma. It's about the harm that has led to that experience, and what can we actually do to do more than just build a house, but wrap community around our young people and provide them with the right support that they need. And so, that's what I hear mostly from our young people, and that's what I've seen work. Just chucking someone in a house and leaving them to it, it doesn't actually solve what's going on for that rangatahi. So the biggest question for me is how do we, have alongside that a right to housing, the right to supported housing, the right to the care and support that our young people need to really heal and recover from the traumatic experience they've gone through.
I loved what we were talking about yesterday of it's kind of a bit trendy to talk about lived experience, and we've identified a lack of lived experience, evidence of that in the gaps in the research and housing. But how do we involve more rangatahi in research while we protect them and not exploit them?
Yeah, a really great question. I think we're talking about how easy it is to go from youth participation to youth exploitation, right? I think it's really core that we hold kind of like a youth development lens, that rangatahi kept at the centre. And that's asking those questions: what do those young people need? How do we support them? How do we care for them, both through the process and after? I have to do a shout out to my good mate Brooke Turner, who's done some really good research with some rangatahi recently, and the process that he went through, I think, was really commendable. You know, he formed really strong relationships with those in the sector who were serving our rangatahi. He brought really good relationships with the young people, kind of went at their pace to build that relationship until they were ready to kind of do the research component and do the interviews. And then he was patient. It's really important to recognize that when you're asking for a young person to share their lived experience, you're asking them to share their trauma, their heartache, their pain. And you're all there with them in a moment, but when you leave, you've brought all that stuff up and it's still there with them. So it's really important that they've got the support around them. That actually, you know, we're not just, you bring a young person from the street and then send them back, that they've got the services around them to ensure that they've got some support and care as well, but also that you go at their pace. It's going to take a while for them to build trust. And then sometimes the reality is their lives are chaotic. They may really want to meet with you and share this stuff because, you know, they want to see change happen. And a lot of the young people I speak to, man, they're really passionate about being a part of the solution. They want to see that change happen. They want to share their stories because they want their stories to make a difference. They want the thing that happened to them to mean something. But you have to be patient to go with them where they're at. They're still going through that experience. And so setting a time, and then if they don't turn up, you know, ditching, it's not going to be helpful. It's really important that you kind of go through that journey. And that could be, you know, 6 months longer than you first anticipated, because it's just taking that time. So yeah, I think that's really important. Keep your young people at the center, understand what their needs are, and work really closely with those who are walking the journey with them.
I think that also talks to the way research is designed from beginning to end. So more in that participatory action research, whānau of methodologies. I think I know community research would like to see special consideration for methodologies when we work with rangatahi. And yeah, so thank you. So same question to you around, if you were given magic money, what needs to be and should be researched right now, given the resources?
There's a lot in the youth space, the rangatahi homelessness space, that I'd love to see highlighted. I guess we still don't quite have a grasp of the numbers. You know, we kind of have an idea. I believe the counts that we have are likely an undercount. So getting like a really clear grasp of those who are experiencing homelessness, so we have a real clear understanding of the size and scope. I definitely like to see a deeper understanding of the causes that lead young people to experience homelessness. So we in the sector, you know, we have a lot of knowledge from lived experience. You know, we definitely hear those stories and we can see it ourselves in terms of those pipelines towards homelessness. But really getting some good solid data and research on that would be really important, I think, so we can, you know, strongly advocate for our rangatahi into the future and for future generations, and close those pipelines. Yeah.
And if anyone's listening and is about to send Aaron an email going, hey, let's catch up about, just know that just because Aaron is part of community, it doesn't mean he's going to give it for free and use his resources that he'll be using for other things. I think there needs to be more consideration for how we value this, voices from the community in action. So thank you, Aaron. Hopefully we'll be asking you some more questions. Thank you so much. So now I'd love to introduce Meyer Peteli, who is from Kahungunu Whānau Services. He'll also speak to some of the questions from a housing provider perspective. Thank you for being here, and from your unique place. We know you often deal with quite urgent things, so it's really wonderful that you've given your time here. So you're the housing manager for Kahungunu Whānau Services, working with closely with whānau and communities on the ground. So tēnā koe mai, if you'd like to introduce yourself and just talk a bit about what Kahungunu Whānau Services do, who they work with and how they work.
Kia ora everyone, Meyer Peteli. I mean, it's an honour to speak alongside all these wonderful people. Yes, like Janine said, I look after our housing space here. A little bit about Kahungunu. We specialise in housing, starting from emergency housing, transitional housing, housing first, all the way to permanent housing. We are currently about to move into home ownership or progressive home ownership. We just got some new builds that we currently own, and we're hoping to go down that way and kind of remove ourselves from the temporary housing that we're currently in. I've worked here for maybe about 2.5 years, and I've done various roles with Kahungunu Whānau Services, from frontline to managing, and then now I currently look after our whole social housing space here at KWS.
That's beautiful, thank you. And who do you work with? What other agencies or groups or collectives do you work with to get your mahi done?
The main agencies that I work with specifically is with MSD and MHUD, Ministry of Housing and Urban Development, more on a strategic level and more in terms of trying to find easier ways that we can help support our whānau. Everyone knows what it's like going to MSD and, for example, trying to get into emergency housing costs you an arm and a leg just to get a no at the end of it. So that's pretty much my job, is working with them in terms of just finding quicker ways that our frontline workers, different avenues that they can take to get our whānau, or the people we service, into housing quicker.
And what do you continue to see, that whether you've had a deep dive into the report or that you into the gaps, what are the things that you continue to see that really don't change, that you think a more robust and holistic look at research in the housing space could help address?
I know one of the biggest problems with housing is that a lot of the solutions are only temporary. And a lot of the, especially in the housing space, it creates more problems. There's a lot of money pumped, I believe anyway, this is my own whakaaro, but there's a lot of money pumped into the wrong places. You got too many short-term housing solutions, but there's not enough money pumped into long-term solutions, especially around housing. And I don't think you find that with housing, a lot of the middle class are the ones that get affected the most. Although they earn too much to fit under the criteria, but then they don't earn enough to survive. So you'll see that we kind of veer off what we're supposed to be doing in order to support a lot of our whānau.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I need to ask you, what is the one thing that you continue to kind of scream and shout about that you don't want to have to scream and shout about again?
Our biggest is mental health and housing. I think there's not enough services out there that provide that wraparound support, or that specialise in that kind of support when it comes to housing. There's only ones that will support those with mental health issues that are on a extreme level. But those that aren't so much, that I've been working with here in Wellington up there is it's very, very little. And for us at Kahungunu Whānau Services, we don't specialise in mental health. And some of the other agencies that we kind of refer them out to, there's always a massive waiting list. Yet the needs of the people to be housed are quite urgent. And that's probably, out of all the problems that we face, it is around the mental health. Yeah, just there's not as much support as I believe there should be.
Thank you. And what kind of solutions? It's such a icky word. What are you seeing on the ground where people are either working collectively or coming up with brilliant ideas, whether it's some of the whānau that you support or even individuals and agencies who may not be able to really implement things that they'd like to see? What are you seeing where you go, oh, that's inspiring, that's innovative?
Yeah, a lot of situations like that has been a lot of the frontline workers, I guess they start thinking outside the box. They don't necessarily work within their work hours. A lot of them do a lot of mahi in their own time that they aren't paid for. But their main priority is the welfare of the whānau. And so my job basically is just to try and find funding for that kind of thing that we tend to do things first and then we get money for it later. But there's a lot of, there's a lot of organisations that close, particularly at 5 on a Friday. And then there's a lot of situations that happened over the weekend, especially for us as a Māori chip. A lot of the houses that we have were actually the tenant. So we sublease it to the whānau that we provide. So there's a lot of situations that we have to attend to in the weekend. Otherwise it puts us at risk of losing the actual property. And then it takes away that opportunity for whānau to go in there.
And there's a research kind of project right there, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
What's being done that isn't being done.
Yeah, it's hard to. A lot of the issues don't happen between the business hours of 9 to 5. You know what I mean?
Sorry, I've just been trying to mute Aaron instead of unmuting myself.
No, that's cool.
Thank you. That's really brilliant. Thank you so much for being here, and we hope a couple of questions for you a bit later. But thank you so much for your time. Thank you. So now, love to introduce to you Ben Lee Harwood. Ben joined Community Housing Aotearoa. He and CHA is one of the collections that we've identified and will be in a link to their collection will be on our special collection site, which we'll talk to you about in a minute. So CHA are a community housing sector peak body. Ben's been there as a policy analyst since 2020. He completed his master's in political science on examining how people perceive of their income, where misperceptions arise, and how this informs a preference or opposition to redistributive policies. Ben's role at CHA is focused on informing the design and services and policies to reflect the interests of their members, their tenants, and a housing system which recognises the principles of the right to a decent home. Tēnā koe, Ben, if you'd like to just introduce yourself, a bit more of an overview of CHA if I haven't done a great job, and what your partners do and your current mahi there.
Thank you, Janie. Kia ora, ko Ben Lee Harwood, toko ingoa. Calling in from Tāmaki Makaurau today, but a Pōneke boy through and through. I've been at CHA for coming up 3.5 years now, and we're a sector body for the community housing sector alongside Te Matapihi. Our members are community housing providers, planners, researchers, councils, anyone who has an interest in creating a more equitable and rights realising housing system. Directly, our members provide approximately 19,000 homes to 40,000 people and do amazing work each day. And we do our best to represent their interests to government, provide advice, host webinars, assist registration and compliance, and also interface with government. It's an honour to be here today, and hope I can do credit to all the speakers who came before me. Not an easy job to do, so kia ora.
You are amazing too, Ben. So just thinking about some of the gaps that we've identified in our report, what's your response to that?
Hi, well, it's a lot of the things that we've seen ourselves, both in our research. We conduct research ourselves and also facilitate and input others' research, like my colleague Amanda Kelly, who worked on the housing and support options for women experiencing homelessness for the Centre of Social Impact, and my colleague Chris Gordell, who worked on the alternative tenure paper for BBHTC alongside Livingston Associates. And I think there's lots of overlap there, and starting to address some of those gaps that community research identified through the collection. Broadly, we have seen a lack of information, research out there about the private rental market. I think that's likely to come to a head soon, just acknowledging that I think BBHTC found that approximately 350,000 households were in housing affordability stress. We know that's just getting harder and harder as interest rates rise, rents climb, wages stagnate, the cost of living increases. So we know how hard families are doing out there, especially in the rental market, which probably constitutes 60 or 70% of those households in affordability stress. So we really need to start thinking about how we create opportunities to ladder out of those, also understanding how people's housing aspirations may change, and also really unpacking what sort of rental for life housing scenarios look like in Aotearoa, just as a consequence of an underinvestment and under-regulation, and as we said, those cost of living prices that just keep compounding. I think the other side of that is we need to hear more directly from communities in that lived experience space, which community research also acknowledged. Providers communicate every day with their whānau. They reflect their input into their services. They're doing really difficult work, but it's often under-resourced. It can be difficult to go above and beyond in the current environment. So it's really looking for opportunities to really enable that to happen, and then also reflecting some of those findings in research, which is lack of, but I think it's also important to acknowledge just every day how those engagements are occurring and services are being informed.
Thank you. And there's some fantastic research on the Community Housing Aotearoa site. So well done to you and all your amazing colleagues. But again, we have this beautiful research and we're gobsmacked at how much there has been done. But kind of so what? And then what? How can we actually make research affect more action and change? Is it in the co-design space? Is it in how it's communicated? Is it how's it researched? What's your response to that?
Yeah, I think for me, it's very much bottom up. I think it's looking for opportunities where researchers can work with communities, be it providers or community groups directly, acknowledging that the system can stagger behind, can be sometimes decades behind some of the perspectives and approaches that our members are taking. So really looking for opportunities where community groups can lead that and show the real value add of research in the space, and that intersection where where the system might be lagging behind. I think specifically about the recent methamphetamine regulations. We heard time and time again from providers that they've taken a really research-informed harm reduction approach to methamphetamine regulation to try keep people in healthy homes. And when the regulations recently came out, we saw that there was the potential for this to exacerbate family harm. So again, there's a little bit of a disconnect, and providers and the community can be a real leader in the space, and it's just enabling that to happen and letting those attitudes sort of move up. As we said, 40,000 people in community housing provider homes, a responsive community can improve the health, well-being, and housing outcomes of a lot of people. then, you know, sort of work from there to address some of these bigger system issues.
Thank you, Ben. And again, for you, what research needs to be done right now and should be done, given the resources that you would like to see from your quite unique perspective and CHA's quite unique perspective?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I'm not sure if I have a great answer. There's so much that needs to be done in the space. We know, you know, we've had so many examples of understanding the level of housing vulnerability and affordability stress there is out there. So, you know, we probably don't need another finding into that, but it's looking for some real tangible solutions. I think coming from the community housing side, I'm really encouraged by the work being done by Motu Research in contextualizing the right to a decent home in Aotearoa, and really unpacking what that means and how we can measure against it and how we can hold various stakeholders accountable against it. From a community housing provider's perspective, unpacking what evaluative frameworks look like. How do we know a certain service, a certain way of working has been successful? You know, we need to move away from these value for money approaches which don't acknowledge well-being or rights or accessibility or access to services, and take a more holistic approach. So really understanding ways to better unpack that and building them in at the top so we can ensure that the quality of services are constantly improving and people are having better housing outcomes for it.
Beautiful, thank you. So we do have time for some questions. If people who are watching, please beam your questions in. Jordan will do her best to pick out some beauties. But I just wondered for the panelists, do you have any questions? Any support or comments or anything that you would like to say that might help this collective here that we have? There was obviously a bung question. I've had some beautiful conversations with all of you in the last week, and there is just way too much to talk about. I wonder if you could, or whoever would like to talk about what housing might look like in the future. We've mentioned climate change, and then of course there's climate change justice in that. What are some other things that that will be affecting housing quite dramatically that we need to address, not in a 5-year strategy, but pretty much now?
I'll just come. I think in the future that the housing is only going to increase, especially social housing. The salaries don't necessarily match the rent prices here in Wellington. The cost of living here in Wellington it's too much for those that are on the living wage, etc. And I'm not too sure what the statistics are there in terms of the average income that's here in Wellington. But I do know things like the census are extremely important, because as you know, with homelessness, it's intergenerational. And the problem with the census forms is the amount of knowledge that people don't understand, especially the ones that we service. They think that those census forms get given to agencies like MSD, and obviously some people aren't on the right benefits that they should be on, etc. So a lot of that information that they need from the census doesn't get put in there, because a lot of the whānau are scared that they're going to get called out for being on a single mother's benefit when the husband's there and so the kids are there. Like you don't get to capture the true amount of people that are actually homeless.
And as you say, the true responses that are happening after hours by people, who work for places like Kahungunu Whānau services. And another shout out there to, the extra work that people do in this sector. And that it's our own hauora and well-being that, we also really need to focus on. Yeah,
absolutely. We are quite privileged with our relationship with our funders. a lot of our contracts, they are quite flexible, and at least it allows us to work in our way, you know, as a kaupapa Māori organisation, to work it through our way instead of the way it's been set out in our contracts. And we are quite transparent, especially with the people that we do house. A lot of them don't fit in the criteria, but our funders do know. But you know, what other option is there for these families? So, you know, I guess that's the biggest thing, is, you know, having us, you know, we are quite privileged in that space.
Well deserved. A question for Aaron. After COVID and the lockdowns, there was this groundswell of giving extra to support and really listening to communities, and we all hoped that that would last. What are you seeing about lessons learned from that response, which we're now heading into the flooding and all the other kinds of things? Like, let's just not wait for the next disaster that affects everybody. What are you seeing that needs to change?
Yeah, I think COVID was a really important moment in that it gave us a collective imagination, right? It proved to us that, you know, we can move mountains when the collective willpower is there, you know, and we did. You know, some of the things that government community partnerships pulled off was really amazing. I guess what we've seen since then is kind of going back a little bit to business as usual in some spaces. You know, once again, having to kind of fit in with the boxes and the legislation that we have, whereas we were able to find really creative solutions. You know, one example is we were able to work really, did some great work with MSD and Tamaki around how do we get rangatahi into emergency accommodation as quickly as possible. And at times we were moving young people into EH within 20 minutes, you know, whereas since then, you know, we've kind of gone back to our processes, which obviously are there for the reason, but the question is, how do we actually design these services? How do we design legislation? How do we design the systems that we have to really meet the needs of our young people and our whānau? And that was the question we were all asking during COVID. And that was where we were all freed up, I guess, to work together collaboratively within government, within community, to ensure that actually our whānau, our rangatahi were placed at the centre. I think there's an opportunity for us to really understand again that for those experiencing homelessness and poverty, that is a crisis, you know, that is as heavy and as real as COVID was for a lot of people. And so then the question is, how do we remake our systems and our structures to respond to that crisis adequately? I don't believe we are currently. But when we understand it within that context, I think that frees us up to be a lot more creative and innovative.
Beautiful, thank you. And we've got some beautiful questions coming in, which we won't have time for, but there is a beautiful one here that is from someone who works within government and asks about the evidence to inform policy. How can research support the work that Aaron, Meyer and others do in the housing space? Would anyone like to offer some perspective on wisdom on that? I mean, you've all identified areas that need to be tapped into, but what about how can research more generally support the work that you do?
I think one point perhaps is the research gives us solid evidence to make our whānau's lived experience visible. It's one thing to go to government and say, "Help, here's the problem." You know, we can all tell you it's a problem, but often to be able to get the funding and to actually change the systems that we need, you know, government needs that written down. You know, they need that quantified. They need that sort of in black and white. And so, you know, I see research as being really powerful in terms of elevating the lived experience of our whānau and saying, look, here it is. You can't argue with it. It's real. Let's do something about it.
Beautiful. And perhaps there's a wider another discussion at some point around within housing NGOs and people who work on the community space to get together and advocate for some more kind of collective research. Because we know it's often driven by these amazing research companies, but perhaps there's an opportunity there. There's another question here. How can the sector collaborate on bringing all our data and insights together? I might just add, in the housing space. Might just be a hanging question there. There's obviously someone who's identified the need for bringing the data. I mean, you've all identified that some data that's not even there, but how do we actually bring all this data together?
Yeah, in terms of bringing all the data together, there are, for example, there's some government agencies that actually already have that information, which is the one that collects all, you know, like collectively for community housing providers here in Wellington. They all have that information already. They may not have the true figures, but they'll have a, you know, they'll have a ballpark figure of majority, because obviously with a lot of the mahi that we do report on it, especially the mahi that we don't get paid for. We still report on it so that we can utilize it for when we're trying to aim for more funding. So a lot of that data is actually collected. I just don't know what to do.
Beautiful, thank you. Well, look, we're nearing the end, and we actually have to launch this thing, which is hopefully live on our website now. If it is, if someone from Community Research could just put the link in, and the report will be on there. And I have learnt the sign language for home. So I wonder if we could all join together and do this, and just have a few seconds of contemplation on what you're going to do in your own life to better outcomes and fill some of these gaps. So Mahia te mahia hoa, let's do the work, my friends. Except for our panelists, they need to lie down in a tropical holiday. So thank you very much. Tēnā rawa atu koutou. Thank you so much for the panelists. You do a lot. You have broken hearts and aspirations on your shoulders, and we hope you get the support that you need to do, or ask for it very stroppily to continue the work that you do. And to Lorna Ingham, our new General Manager at Community Research, thank you so much for supporting this work, even though you've just started. Again, to Jordan, Sincere and Ray, our kaimahi, and our new tech person who stepped in at the last second. It does take a team. And for all you for showing up in your extremely busy lives, the recording of this webinar will be sent to everyone who registered. Please do share it widely, whether it's to your local politician or to anybody. Please do share it. And we will send you a short survey after the webinar, and you'll get a chance to share your thoughts there too. And please join Community Researchers at eNews if you haven't already, our database, and also our database if you are a community researcher or evaluator. And of course, please upload your own research, lived experience or knowledge. We leave that up to you as to what you feel needs to be validated. And if you do have some of your own individual mahi that wants to be included in the collection, please email research at Community Research. So what's next for Community Research? We have an amazing critical treaty analysis mahi special collection launch very soon. The webinar will be on the 2nd of May. And then we have this beautiful work that we've been working on for a very long time with a lot of you, our symposium, Imagining Futures of Community-Led Research. That's 23rd and 30th of June, a curated online experience over 2 interactive days. And again, ups to Gauri Nandadkar, who's had an exceptional amount of work to do there. So please get in touch with Lorna if you'd like to further this mahi. So he karakia mutunga tēnei. Kua whiria te pō, kua tōmaki a te ao. Kia puta aia ki te whaia ao, ki te ao marama. Humi e, hui e, pai ki e. We have navigated uncertainty, we have gained further understanding. We have drawn together a firm. Go well, everybody.